The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Situated between the Malay archipelago and the northwest coast of Australia, the Timor Sea is home to more than 900 million barrels of crude oil and 12 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. For tiny East Timor, this hydrocarbon wealth presents an opportunity to drag itself out of poverty. But a long-running border dispute with Australia has caused most of these assets to remain underground. Since the 1980s, Canberra has attempted to assert sovereignty over the Timor Sea, sometimes resorting to underhanded tactics to get its way. The result is a history of deception, espionage, and coercion that reveals how large countries strong-arm small ones out of their natural resource endowments. I'm your host Redrawn and welcome to CaspianReport. Today's video is sponsored by World of Tanks, a free-to-play multiplayer game featuring mid-20th century era combat vehicles. At the core of the game, you take control of an armed vehicle of your choice and then you're placed into a battle on a random map. You can roll out across the open fields, climb hills or hide in urban areas, but to win you need to communicate with your allies and come up with a battle plan. There are over 550 tanks to choose from, including destroyers, artillery, light tanks, medium tanks and heavy tanks. And of course, using experience points, you can always modify your tanks to your liking. Click on the link below to try out World of Tanks and use the promo code TANKMANIA, all capital letters, to get a ton of free perks like 7 days premium account status, 250,000 credits, the premium tank Excelsior, and 3 rental tanks for 10 battles each, which are the Tiger 131, the Cromwell B, and T-34. So click the link below and put your skills to the test. Timor's history has been shaped by the contours of its physical geography. The island sits roughly halfway between Java and New Guinea and about 700 kilometers northwest of Australia. Historically, this central position has made the island a valuable strategic asset. Yet its unforgiving internal geography of tall mountain peaks and low shrublands had confined colonial powers to the island's coast. Geography infused the island with a sense of isolation. So when Portugal colonized East Timor in the early 16th century, the territory was used as a tropical gulag for political prisoners and a cheap source of cash crops like coffee and sandalwood. The remoteness was such that Lisbon did not bother to settle its border with Dutch-controlled West Timor until 1914. This seclusion was only disrupted by the events of World War II. When Japan invaded the island in 1942, local Timorese assisted Dutch and Australian troops in drawing the Japanese into a costly guerrilla conflict. Even when the Allied forces quit the island a year later, the locals continued to resist Japanese occupation, resulting in the deaths of around 70,000 Timorese civilians. After the war, the western half of the island became part of Indonesia, while the eastern half was returned to Portugal, where it remained a colonial backwater. But although time stood still in Portuguese Timor, the world around it was changing rapidly. By the 1960s, advances in oil drilling technology began to open the world's oceans to oil and gas exploration. This brought the issue of maritime borders in the Timor Sea to the forefront. Seeking to maximize its share of seabed resources, in 1962 Australia made a continental shelf claim that extended all the way to the Timor Trough, a deep-water valley that ran to within 75 kilometers of the Timorese coast. Thereafter, Australia began to issue oil exploration permits to areas all over the Timor Sea. Naturally, both Jakarta and Lisbon rejected Canberra's claim. Instead, they argued that Australia and Timor shared a continental shelf and that the boundary should be drawn at the median line according to international law. However, this would place most of the hydrocarbon resources out of Australia's reach and invalidate the permits Canberra had already issued. So, with both oil royalties and international prestige at stake, the pieces were in place for a game of diplomatic chess. Australia adopted a strategy of divide and conquer. Its policymakers knew that the best way of securing seabed rights was to separate Lisbon and Jakarta. To this end, Canberra began to court Indonesia by offering economic and military aid, as well as recognizing Indonesia's archipelago principle, which is a doctrine that allowed Jakarta to treat the valuable shipping lanes running through its territory as internal waters. In exchange, Indonesia would draw its maritime border halfway between the Timor Trough and the median line, allowing the mining licenses issued by Canberra to remain valid. In 1972, these terms were codified by the Timor Sea Treaty, but this deal was not what it seemed. As was later revealed, Australia had conducted a secret geological survey 2 years earlier, which discovered that the Timor Trough was not a geological fault line as Canberra had claimed, but rather a wrinkle in a single continental shelf. Jakarta's original assumption had been correct, and according to international law, it was entitled to all the seabed resources on its side of the median line. Australian diplomats had concealed the existence of the geological survey to extract concessions from Indonesia, and it worked. Canberra gained a valuable piece of real estate at the expense of Jakarta. Having settled the border with Indonesia, Australian lawmakers turned to Portuguese Timor. In between was a 500-kilometer wide zone known as the Timor Gap, whose seabed rights remained unresolved. The overthrow of the Portuguese dictatorship in 1974 and the rise of the Timorese independence groups only complicated matters. Canberra was uncertain whether it should negotiate with Portugal, Indonesia, or the de facto independent East Timorese government located in Dili. Interestingly, though Australia supported East Timor's right to self-determination in public, behind the scenes, Australian diplomats were urging Jakarta to integrate the territory into Indonesia. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, both Australia and Indonesia feared that an independent East Timor would not be economically viable, making it vulnerable to communist influence. Against the backdrop of the Cold War, this was a reasonable concern. Secondly, Canberra believed that incorporating the territory into Indonesia would make it easier for Australia to claim the resources in the Timor Gap, since it had already established a maritime border with Jakarta. As such, in a private meeting in September 1972, Indonesian and Australian officials declared that an independent East Timor would be a thorn in the eye of Australia and a thorn in Indonesia's back. So, with Canberra's endorsement, Jakarta began to intervene in East Timor's affairs, beaming propaganda into the territory and sponsoring armed opposition groups in an attempt to dislodge the pro-independence forces. When the coup failed, Indonesia began to plot a full-scale invasion. The United States, which at the time supplied around 90% of Indonesia's weapons, expressed that if Jakarta wanted to annex East Timor, it should do so quickly. Immediately after this endorsement, the Indonesian invasion of East Timor commenced. What followed was an occupation marked by extreme violence, including extrajudicial killings and forced starvations. Roughly 200,000 East Timorese, or 1/3 of the population, were deprived of existence. By July 1976, Indonesia had taken effective control of the territory, while nationalist resistance groups retreated into the mountains. Now, all that was left was for Canberra to grant the occupation diplomatic recognition, which would allow Australia and Indonesia to carve up the oil-rich Timor Gap between themselves. A segment of the Australian public objected, especially veterans who had fought alongside the Timorese during World War II, but lawmakers in Canberra went ahead regardless. As such, in 1979, Australia recognized East Timor as Indonesian territory, and a decade later, Canberra and Jakarta inked the Timor Gap Treaty, which split the area into Australian and Indonesian zones and a joint area of cooperation. As construction began on the pipeline networks to cement the Timor Gap Treaty, reports of continued human rights abuses kept the island in the international spotlight. So, when the Suharto government collapsed in 1989, Jakarta granted East Timor a referendum on independence. By this time, Australia had changed its stance in favor of independence, but it was worried that a sovereign East Timor would tear up the Timor Gap Treaty. That referendum resulted in a landslide vote in favor of independence, and eventually in 2002, East Timor restored its sovereignty. At this point, however, Canberra knew that seabed negotiations with Dili might prove difficult. So, in anticipation, Australia did something unusual. It removed itself from the UN Law of the Sea provisions that would bind it to a ruling at the International Court of Justice. In layman's terms, this meant that East Timor would be unable to take Australia to the court in the event of a disagreement. Yes, it was that kind of a play. Canberra blatantly disregarded the rule of law and opted for power politics. With the law of the sea out of the way, Canberra pressed faulty claims to extract concessions from Dili. In a meeting in November 2002, Australian officials argued for 80% of the rights to the Greater Sunrise oil field, which was the largest of its kind in the Timor Gap and estimated to be worth up to $40 billion. When the East Timorese objected, stating that they were entitled to 100% of the hydrocarbons under the law of the sea, the Australians threatened to stall the development of the energy projects until they got their way. Now, at the time, East Timor was the poorest country in Asia, and the pipeline royalties were Dili's only source of income, which it needed to rebuild the country. Canberra was effectively exploiting the urgency of the situation. Yet, as bad as this sounds, it got worse. When the two countries met for further negotiations in 2004, Australian covert agents placed listening devices in the office of the Prime Minister of East Timor. The goal was to find out the minimum amount Dili would settle for. The bugging operation was exposed in 2012, but not before a 50-50 deal was signed. Canberra gained valuable sources for hydrocarbons while it had no rights to it, and the foreign minister that signed the deal was offered a job at the oil company operating in the Timor Sea. When this scandal went public, East Timor complained to the International Court of Justice on the grounds that Australia had breached its good faith obligations when negotiating the treaty and that the agreement should be invalidated. The Australian government rejected the allegations and then raided the office of East Timor's lawyer, seizing documents to hamper the legal case. Nevertheless, through sheer persistence, Dili eventually forced Canberra back to the negotiating table. Given that Australia was trying to establish itself as an advocate of a regional rules-based order, a legal ruling against it, even if non-binding, would be disastrous for Australian soft power. So, in 2018, the border was redrawn again. This time, 70% of the Greater Sunrise oil field would be on East Timor's side of the boundary. In exchange, Dili would not claim any reparations for hydrocarbon revenue lost since the Indonesian occupation. More importantly, East Timor, having experienced the brunt of Australian soft power, is now making friends with China. Officials in Dili consider it fair game to draw the Chinese into the equation as a balancing power, and Beijing is happy to indulge. Chinese firms are working on multi-million-dollar infrastructure projects. More than 1,000 East Timorese civil servants are being trained in China, while an equal number of Chinese technocrats are involved in East Timor's agriculture, tourism, urban planning, and so on. Needless to say, this partnership is likely to grow with the passing of time. Now, having China so close to its borders clearly upsets Australia, but after decades of ignoring international law, Canberra's call for a rules-based order rings hollow. Australia can choose to pursue realpolitik, or it can follow a rules-based order, but it cannot do both simultaneously, any more than it can mix oil and water. I've been your host Shirvan from CaspianReport. If you approve of our work, please leave a like, comment and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and Sahol.